Hello there, I'm Linor Moudou. Welcome to Africa 54. Here is what's coming up. U.S. President Joe Biden welcomes NATO leaders, advocating for peace through strength amid Europe's largest peace challenge in decades. U.S. lawmakers return to Washington this week with calls from Capitol Hill urging Biden to step aside after disappointing debate performance. And environmental journalists in Africa face increasing violence, detainment, and even death as they report on illegal poaching, mining, and pollution. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. It is day 2 of the NATO summit taking place in Washington, D.C. On Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden welcomed NATO leaders and heralded the alliance's 75th anniversary while making the case for peace through strength amid the largest challenge to peace Europe has faced in decades. Other administration officials made similar arguments for bolstering defense to fight global threats. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from Washington.
President Joe Biden made a forceful case for peace through strength as NATO members gathered Tuesday in Washington to mark the 75th anniversary of the Security Alliance, as it faces what may be the biggest test in its history.
It's good that we're stronger than ever, because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
His argument was bolstered by other members of his administration on Tuesday, with his national security advisor speaking to defense industry executives and invoking a Roman adage: if you want peace, prepare for war. And the alliance's chief began making his pitch, literally and rhetorically, right after landing in Washington.
Great pitch!
Sign a new defense industrial pledge. And that will be a pledge that will help to make our industry across Europe and North America stronger, more innovative, and capable of producing at scale.
Biden, in his remarks, acknowledged Stoltenberg's role in the alliance by surprising the former Norwegian Prime Minister with the U.S.'s top civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
I keep seeing all those stories.
But analysts ask whether this show of presidential power at the summit can obscure Biden's obvious political troubles at home, after a poor debate showing led to mounting calls for him to leave November's presidential race.
It should remind us of the criticality of American leadership of this alliance. It is an American creation. It survives and prospers and thrives and has thriven on American leadership. And when doubts arise about American leadership and American leaders, the alliance, when the American president catches a cold, NATO gets pneumonia.
It's a sobering thought as NATO meets under the hospitality of an embattled American president, that his weakness, and likewise his strength, are contagious. Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
For more on the NATO Alliance Summit, Carla Babb, VOA Pentagon correspondent, is standing by for us from the Washington Convention Center. Carla, thanks for joining us. There has been some big announcement out of the summit pledging more Ukrainian support. What are you hearing?
Well, good evening. Lots of love for Ukraine today. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin just confirmed that the transfer of F-16s from NATO countries to Ukraine is underway as we speak. This is something that we have been looking forward to for several weeks now. And Secretary also said that they would be operational and flying over Ukraine by this summer. That is something that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, told VOA last month. So we are hearing it again that they do plan to have F-16s over the skies of Ukraine in the coming weeks. In addition to that, President Joe Biden, he hasn't spoken yet today, but while he was speaking last night, he did talk about 5 new air defense systems for Ukraine, including a U.S. Patriot that had not been previously announced. He said that there will be 3 Patriots, one from the U.S., Germany, and Romania. The Netherlands is also working to submit parts with other nations that will comprise a 4th Patriot, and Italy is sending a SAM-T. After those get in place, the U.S. and other countries say that dozens of short-range and medium-range air defense systems will be coming into Ukraine in the coming weeks and months as well. That is big news for Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been begging for air defense systems, particularly Patriots, for several weeks. He asked specifically for 7 Patriots. He's only getting 5 big air defense systems, but still a major win for Ukraine.
Carla, Ukraine has wanted greater assurances for NATO membership this week. What kind of assurances are NATO members talking about?
Well, they're really hyping up the language here. In fact, the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, had said that the path to membership for Ukraine to join NATO is irreversible at this point. And Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, in fact, went a little bit further today when asked about this. He said, look, we've got to lay this out to make it clear to Russia that they can't continue to attack other nations. He said the only way that Ukraine can stop the fighting after the war ends is NATO membership, because if they have some sort of ceasefire, they've seen Russia in the past go back in and attack Georgia in 2008, attack Crimea in Ukraine in 2014, and then attack in 2022. So they said really the only way to stop Russia is to make them a member of NATO, make Ukraine a member of NATO, so then they know if they touch Ukrainian soil again, then they are invoking all NATO members to defend that part, that territory that will now be NATO territory.
Carla, thank you for staying on top of the story. We appreciate it. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb reporting live from the Washington Convention Center. Now, the NATO Alliance's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has called the support of Ukraine the most urgent task of the 3 meeting, as NATO looks to celebrate its 75th anniversary and address how best to support Ukraine in its ongoing war against Russia. How are non-member states reacting? VOA's Philip Alexiou spoke to Sophie Arts, a fellow at the non-profit German Marshall Fund, for a look into the international community's expectation and reaction.
I would say NATO has never been as critical as it is today since its beginning, dating back to the Cold War. And of course, we're seeing a renewed focus on NATO's core mission, which is territorial defense in Europe. What we're also seeing an increasing focus on global threats, which is why not only NATO's core alliance members are really key to the alliance, but also its partnerships. So NATO is placing a lot of importance in its partnerships with other partners, including in the Indo-Pacific, but also other global partners that are really elevating its importance across the world.
Now we have a presidential election coming up. Of course, President Biden struggling and getting a lot of flack from just about everywhere from his presidential debate performance a couple of weeks ago. But how is he going to perform during the summit? I think it's a question on many people's minds. But at least looking at President Biden and the way he looks at NATO and the usefulness of NATO compared to his presidential challenger, former President Donald Trump, and how he looks at NATO and what he thinks NATO should or should not be used for. How would you compare the two?
I think the major difference is that President Biden is very focused on maintaining alliance cohesion. He's very focused on building consensus across the alliance, which is really critically important as well when it comes to the NATO's ability to deter threats. Whereas, of course, under President Trump's previous leadership, we had seen more of a bilateralization of relationships, more of a transactional approach to relations with individual allies. So that is an expectation, if he were to come to power again, that might be the case again in the future, where individual relationships with individual allies would play a more important role and could, of course, become more politicized as well.
What would have to come out of this summit in order for it to be effective, or to call it successful?
Absolutely. Well, everyone is looking towards the outcome regarding Ukraine, regarding the future path to membership for Ukraine. And I think it's a question of how strong the language will be. Most countries and analysts in different NATO countries are hoping for stronger language regarding Ukraine's membership or Ukraine's path to membership in the future than we saw at the Vilnius summit last year. There's a lot of effort being placed into determining the language ahead of time, so there's no discord during the summit or active debate. So I think a stronger language on Ukraine would be key. A clear path that makes clear that that Ukraine will in the future be part of NATO is one of the key deliverables. And I think there's a lot of other things that analysts are watching for as well. For instance, NATO is making decisions to resource its defense plans, which are the most robust defense plans since the Cold War. So this is also, in many ways, a summit that will ensure that NATO has the capabilities that it needs to defend its territory and to make sure that the strategic plans that it's outlining are actually implementable and that it can defend every inch of the alliance.
That was Sophie Arts, a fellow at the non-profit German Marshall Fund, speaking with VOA's Philippe Alexiou. French and Gabonese troops have inaugurated a military administration school at the French base in Libreville. Officials say it symbolizes a new partnership focused on training in parallel with the reduction of the French presence in Africa.
This transfer is a shared desire of our two presidents, who decided between the French and the Gabonese authorities to make this General de Gaulle camp a joint training center. It's a historic development because I'd say it marks an important turning point, turning the de Gaulle camp from a pre-positioned base for French elements in Gabon into a center of excellence for training that will enable it to have an impact throughout the continent.
General Jean-Martin Ossimandong, Secretary General of the Gabonese Ministry of National Defense, said the long-standing partnership between Gabon and France deserves to be reviewed and adapted to today's context. U.S. lawmakers returned to the nation's capital this week for the first time since President Joe Biden's disappointing performance. In the presidential debate against presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump late last month, VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson reports on calls from Capitol Hill for Biden to step aside.
U.S. President Joe Biden facing questions from within his own party this week as lawmakers return to Washington and concerns that Biden's poor debate performance will quash his chances to beat Donald Trump in the November general election.
He just has to step down because he can't win.
Representative Mike Quigley, one of a handful of House and Senate Democrats who have publicly expressed concerns that Biden has not made the case he is healthy enough to serve another 4 years. But the majority of Democrats still pledge their support.
President Biden is the nominee, and we support the Democratic nominee that will be Donald Trump. That is the fact.
The White House said Biden's debate performance was a temporary misstep.
He had a bad night. We've talked about it. He understands people's concerns. We have been out there, as we have been in previous months. You see from his engagement with everyday people on the ground.
One analyst told VOA that lawmakers aren't the only ones Biden needs to win over.
He needs to hear their concerns. He needs to be honest with them about where he has liabilities and what his plan is to attack those liabilities. but he also has a PR problem with voters out there. It doesn't it matters a lot that Democrats are sitting lawmakers are upset with their own candidate, but it matters more if voters don't see him as a viable option.
Top House Republicans said Tuesday administration officials should consider using a constitutional amendment that allows the vice president to remove an incapacitated president from office.
There is no longer any doubt that Joe Biden is unfit to be our commander-in-chief. The Biden White House, far-left House Democrats, and the mainstream media are in complete disarray because they know this to be true.
But with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer not wavering in his support,
I'm with Joe.
The scenario of replacing Biden with Vice President Kamala Harris as the nominee is still unlikely.
This is probably the most significant election of our lifetime.
Democrats will formally appoint their nominee at their convention in mid-August. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
We'll be right back after this short break.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, leaders of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, gather in Washington to commemorate 75 years of the alliance. The summit is set to address pressing global challenges and reinforce the organization's strategic direction. Join me, Vincent McCory, on the next edition of Straight Talk Africa as we take a closer look at NATO's milestones over the decades and what nature of relationship exists between the military alliance and the African Union.
African governments are wrestling with rising food prices, gas shortages, as well as other economic challenges. Many non-governmental organizations are having to increase their effort in supporting the vulnerable in society. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we'll hear what is being done by Africans for Africans to curb hunger and malnutrition and the women behind the work. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, Uganda on Wednesday dismissed the claims in a report by UN experts that it was backing M23 rebels active in the restive east of the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. The report, commissioned by the UN Security Council and seen by AFP this week, alleged active support for the M23 by Ugandan army and military intelligence officials. Scientists in Sierra Leone are using the lessons learned a decade ago fighting the hemorrhagic Ebola virus to try to stop Lassa fever in its tracks. While cases have largely plateaued in Sierra Leone, researchers are seeing a spread beyond traditional Lassa hotspots. Zimbabwe has revised its economic growth forecast downwards. Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube said economic growth is forecast at 2% for 2024, down from 3.5% forecast in November due to an El Niño-induced drought. Zimbabwe is among the hardest hit by drought in the region, impacting crop yields. Violence against reporters covering environmental issues is trending upwards, according to UNESCO and media advocates. For VOA News, Robin Guess reports.
Ghana's Joy News covers illegal gold mining destroying the country's forest.
Abandoned pits and mining settlements dot the road leading into the remaining part of the forest.
When journalist Arastu Sasari Dankour went to investigate, armed men in uniform confronted him and his crew.
They wrestled with my camera technician for the camera and broke it in the process. They made him delete every footage we had on the camera. They smashed our windscreen, punched my driver several times in the face, and it was horrible.
Ghana's 2022 Journalist of the Year, Asare Dankour, documents the environmental cost of illegal gold mining. His stories expose the connections of illegal mining to the spread of disease, deforestation, and widespread pollution in rivers and streams. The International Federation of Journalists finds reporting on poaching, illegal mining, and illegal logging is hazardous across Africa, but legal mining with valuable and
which actually force them to abandon the line of thought or the reports that they are engaging.
In its May report, Press and Planet in Danger, UNESCO finds 749 journalists and media outlets attacked globally from 2009 to 2023, and 44 reporters slain for their environmental coverage.
It shows it's a planetary problem. Journalists were trying to uncover corruption or whatever related to environmental issues. They are being attacked everywhere.
According to UNESCO, attacks against environmental reporters are rising sharply.
The number of attacks, different sorts of attacks, they are concentrated or they are higher in the last 5 years. So it's not only that it's a lot, but it's showing that there is unfortunately a trend of a growing number of attacks or violations.
For journalists on the ground, the risks are ever present.
So constantly, I face danger. I face a lot of danger during my work. Armed people, people who wouldn't want the truth to come out. And so I must say that every trip is a risk.
Asari Duncour says he's only armed with a camera, a drone, and his crew, but adds he cannot let the violence stop him from revealing the environmental damage being done. Robin Guess, VOA News.
The World Health Organization says more farmers in Malawi are benefiting from shifting away from tobacco cultivation just months after the country ratified a treaty that aims to address public health risks associated with tobacco. Lamek Masina has more from Blantyre.
Miriat Ndege, a farmer in Machinga district in southern Malawi, is now growing millet, soybeans, and maize after growing tobacco for 25 years. Low prices coupled with what she calls unfair tobacco buying practices at the market are among the reasons she switched 3 years ago.
Farmers do not have a say on prices offered at auction floors. Sometimes the buyers would even reject tobacco bales. When this happens, I would start borrowing money to pay for transport I used to carry the bills to the auction floors.
Besides growing crops, Ndege also rears goats, doves, chickens, ducks, and peacocks she uses as manure to mitigate the impact of the recent rise in fertilizer prices.
From the time I stopped growing tobacco, my life has changed. For example, last year, I was able to buy a motorbike and a motorcycle, and now I am able to pay school fees for my children who are in secondary schools.
Tobacco has long been a main foreign exchange earner in Malawi, amassing over 50% of the country's export earnings. It has also been the main source of income for many farmers in Malawi.
I have been benefiting a lot from tobacco farming, and I have no plans to quit farming because tobacco is the only source of income.
However, the WHO anti-smoking campaign says tobacco farming poses severe public risks to farmers who may absorb nicotine equivalent to smoking 50 cigarettes a day. The Malawi government took a significant step last year by ratifying WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Treaty, which advocates reduction of tobacco production. However, some farmers who are now growing legumes, such as Said Muhammad, say the challenge is lack of sustainable markets for their crops.
It becomes difficult to find a market for soybeans in our area. As a result, we don't get enough revenue, but we find relief in groundnuts, which are fetching better prices, unlike tobacco, whose prices are unpredictable.
Agriculture experts say there is hope for these farmers, citing the recent announcement by a local manufacturing company to establish a soybean oil extracting industry in Malawi in the next 6 months.
Definitely, we understand that that industry has potential to absorb over 150,000 metric tons of soya. So we believe when it comes to a ready market for soya, then definitely that market will be there.
Chimwaza also says farmers like Ndege are poised to realize more revenue from their harvest following a recent launch of soybean exports to China, which saw a local company sending a 240 metric ton trial consignment to China in May. Lamek Masina, VOA News, Blantyre.
Now, an underwater drone is using artificial intelligence to help survey the Great Barrier Reef as a widespread mass coral bleaching unfolds across the world's most extensive reef ecosystem. Diana Mitchell has this report.
This underwater drone, called Hydrus, is using artificial intelligence to study coral reefs. Australia's Great Barrier Reef has been hit by a major coral bleaching event, triggered by warmer ocean waters. Now, with the help of Hydrus, marine scientists are working toward more accurate and more regular surveys to better understand the impact of climate change. Melanie Olson leads the ReefWorks program at the Australian Institute for Marine Science.
Dive teams can only see so much and go so far, and that's where we've had to augment our survey methods to include the use of robotics, just to enable us to scale, to go deeper, to operate in areas where predators like crocodiles and bull sharks and jellyfish now routinely reside.
Hydrus operates fully autonomously with a range of more than 8 kilometers over 3 hours. It can go as deep as 10,000 feet and captures video with a high-resolution 4K camera. The drone has forward-facing sonar and AI-powered navigation. Advanced Navigation Subsea Product Manager Peter Baker says their technology is being used to build 3D maps of the reef.
We're working on coral mapping with the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and what they're trying to do is map areas of coral to detect change within those areas, which they can then use to extrapolate and model the entire reef. One of the benefits of having a robotic system is that it goes back to that same location every single time, and it takes the same photo from the same orientation every single time, which is really, really difficult to achieve with a human diver.
The Great Barrier Reef has seen 6 localized bleaching events since 1998. Bleached coral can recover if water's cool, but if ocean temperatures remain high for longer periods, it will die. Oceanographers tie this mass bleaching event to climate change. Dina Mitchell, VOA News.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching. Good night.